wait till everyone's finished fidgeting around. I realise that everyone's just eaten, so it takes a while to get people back. And look, I've got a full speech written out, but before I start it, I just want to say a huge thank you to Tuka and his team for inviting me. And I want to say a massive thank you. Where are they? I'm looking for them. Oh, there they are. Tommy and Mira for having me at their house. They've had me at their house for 2 years now. It's always a real pleasure. They get me to and from the airport and make sure I'm here. So thank you so much, guys, for looking after me so well. It always makes it a pleasure being here. Also, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who does support me and watches my shows and stuff like that. It's always really interesting being English and realising that everyone has to listen to me speak in English, but I can't speak a word of their language. And it's even more flattering to know that people in countries that don't speak English do watch my show and my videos and other things that I produce. So thank you for supporting me. And my apologies for being so ignorant that I can't speak a word of your language. But I think that's a bit of a problem with the English in general. We've still got that sort of colonial superiority thing going on. Anyway, before I flew out here, and I was really happy to be invited to this conference, but before I flew out here, I saw an interesting article in the so-called conservative press. And when I say conservative press, I'm talking about the mainstream media outlets that are effectively there to ensure that the masses think that someone's on their side, that someone listens to their complaints, and there's someone in the mainstream who's willing to say what they think. And I think we can categorise the conservative press as either controlled opposition or safety valve media. And the article I'm referencing now, it's particularly interesting, especially considering what the theme of today's conference is. Now, the article in question was on a website and a TV channel now, in fact, called GB News. And it was about a pub in England in a city called Leicester. And the reason this article was being published was because Leicester City Council had given the go-ahead for the pub to be converted into a mosque. Now, before we go any further, it's really important to note that this isn't out of the ordinary. And it's certainly not the first time that something like this had happened. In fact, in the UK, pubs, community centres, historic buildings, and even churches are regularly converted into mosques. And I've actually covered a number of these cases myself. So I found the outrage in the conservative press over one single pub being turned into a mosque pretty strange. But there is another reason why I found the outrage over this case to be strange. Not just because it was just one pub, but we'll get to that in a minute. But before we go any further, I don't want anyone to watch this and misquote me or take any of my comments out of context. So I want to get this really clear with all of you guys and anyone who's watching on stream. I don't want any pubs in Britain to be turned into mosques. In fact, I don't want any more mosques in Britain whatsoever. I don't want pubs, historic buildings or churches turning into mosques. And I'll say this as well. I don't think there should be any mosques in Britain whatsoever. It'd be a better place if it was a no mosque zone. But what I'm saying is, I wasn't shocked about this mosque conversion. And not just because I've seen it happen so many times before. But I was surprised that the conservative media made a big deal out of this. Not least because it happens on a regular basis. But also, and more importantly, I was surprised that the conservative media made a big deal out of this because this particular pub to mosque conversion was happening in a city called Leicester. Now, I mentioned that earlier, and I mentioned that for a very specific reason, because Leicester has the dubious honour of being a historic city in multicultural terms. because it was the first city in the whole of the UK where white Britons, the indigenous people of the British Isles, became a minority. And that, if you hadn't guessed, is the other reason that I wasn't shocked that the pub became a mosque. Because Leicester is now 30% white British. Maybe less. And when I say maybe less, I mean most likely less, because that's based on census reports, and we'll go into that later. Now, the pub in question had also been shut since 2022. It served its last drink around 3 years ago, and it had laid boarded up with huge steel plates covering the windows and doors for about 3 years to stop vandals and squatters entering the premises and smashing it up. Now, that's why I wasn't shocked that this was happening. I wasn't shocked because the pub wasn't in use and it was in the city of Leicester. Whites are a minority. It's being turned into a mosque. But that's the reason I was surprised that the Conservative media was making a big deal out of it. Because Leicester, as a city, has demographically been changed to the point where white Britons are already a minority. It's effectively gone. It's a lost cause. It's been colonised. And that's the real issue. That's the real problem. And a pub being converted into a mosque, if we're all being honest with ourselves, is not actually the problem. It's a symptom of the problem. It's a symptom of the real problem. And the real problem in this case was the changing demographics of the city of Leicester, which led to white people being a minority. And the sad thing is, Leicester is not a one-off. And people who think, well, this must be just an outlying case, sadly they're wrong. Britain's two largest cities, London, our capital, and Birmingham, which is of course the second largest city in Britain, are much the same as Leicester. They're places where white Britons are already a minority. Now, in London, white Britons make up less than 36% of the population, and in Birmingham, white Britons make up less than 42% of the population. But you see, the changing demographic of Britain's largest cities is the one thing that the Conservative media and the press don't like to complain about. They won't complain about that. They'll complain about the pub being converted into a mosque. They might complain that Leicester City Council allowed it to happen, which, let's face it, is totally unsurprising, because if you look at Leicester City Council, 34 of the 54 councillors are, and you've probably guessed it, from an ethnic minority background, because that's what happens when you have demographic change. And the Conservative press might even complain about England's old ways and our heritage disappearing. But again, all of these things aren't the root issue. They are symptoms of the root issue. And again, the root issue of all of these problems is, of course, the sweeping demographic changes that are drastically and rapidly altering the ethnic makeup of the British Isles. And this leads me on to what I was going to speak about, what I was asked to speak about, the theme of the conference, how bad things really are. How rapidly and how drastically these demographic changes are taking place. So, prepare yourselves for the most depressing statistics you're going to hear today. And we're going to start from a logical point. We're going to start from the last census that took place. And that was in 2021. And at the last census, white Britons, the indigenous people, we apparently made up 74.4% of the population. And I know what people say every time I quote that, every time I give that statistic, people say, well, that seems like a substantial majority. But once you look into that figure, you quickly learn that it's the best case scenario. Now, firstly, it's important to acknowledge that the census results are always inaccurate, and they always present a snapshot that is skewed in favour of the indigenous population. Quite simply, because in the census data, white Britons are always over-reported, and ethnic minorities and migrants are always underreported. Most crucially, illegal migrants are not counted in the census because they don't fill it out. They don't get one, they don't fill it out. And this leads us to acknowledge two crucial flaws of the way the census is carried out. It only takes into account the people who fill it out and return it, and the data provided by those who do fill it out is taken on face value. So in other words, if a small house filled with migrants, with 10 occupants, fills it out and says, there's only 3 people living in this house, well, according to the census, there's only 3 people living in that house. That's how it works. So let's take a look at these illegal migrants, because the illegal migrants, as we mentioned earlier, they're not accounted for. And depending on the estimate you believe, there is between 1 and 2 million illegal migrants living in Britain. And those illegal migrants living in Britain have birthed approximately 144,000 babies on British soil. And these are huge numbers that aren't accounted for. And I mentioned the big cities earlier. Well, in London, they estimate that there's between at least 700,000 and 1 million illegal migrants living in London alone. Then there's the issue of large migrant families sharing those small houses that I talked of earlier. As mentioned, these large families often underreport their size. They underreport the number of people living at a single address, and this is either for tax purposes or for other shady reasons. But again, it represents an underreporting of migrants living in Britain. And finally, there's a language barrier. Many migrants don't speak English, and therefore they get a census through the door. They don't know what it says. They're unable to fill it out. That's the end of that. And some people might say, oh, well, Mark, that's a small issue. It's not a small issue. In certain towns and cities in Britain, there are huge areas where English is no longer the dominant language, where people do not speak English or they speak English as a second language. And this is why some councils in Britain and the National Health Service have interpreters on hand 24/7 to deal with people in areas where there are these communication issues, so that services can be provided to people who can't even speak the language. And these people are all migrants or of migrant background. This all means that the people most likely to fill out the census are law-abiding white Britons. Hence, the census is skewed toward representing the indigenous people and underreports the issue of demographic change. So that 74.4% I quoted earlier, the official figure in 2021, that truly is the best case scenario. But it gets worse because there's a second problem with the census data, and that is it is out of date. The last census, as I've said many times, took place in 2021. It's 4 years old. And in those 4 years, Britain has experienced what is known as the Boris wave. And that is the largest influx of both illegal and legal migrants the country has ever witnessed. In one single year, over 900,000 migrants legally settled in Britain within 12 months. The numbers that we're talking about are so vast that the government either has no real handle on how large they are or has been deliberately massaging the figures. Because every time the government releases a new press release, they revise the figures upwards and admit, well, actually, it was 100,000 more. Actually, it was 100,000 more. So they're either lying to us or they don't even know how many are coming in. And this has left us in a position where now, as of a few months ago, the mainstream media, and this is the mainstream media, the group that hates us, have now themselves admitted that white Britons make up, in their estimation, around 70% of the population. And when I hear the word around placed before a stated figure, I always raise an eyebrow. Because it obviously means one of two things. Either the people talking don't know what the real figure is, or they do know what the real figure is, but they're hiding it. But for today's purposes, let's work with that figure. Let's give the media the benefit of the doubt and settle on the figure that Britain is 70% white British. And we're going to settle on it because it's an easy figure. It's a nice round figure to work with going forward. And it still sounds like a good number, doesn't it? It still sounds like a substantial majority. 70%, good number, it's high. 70 out of 100, people would say substantial majority. And it sounds good. Do you think it sounds good? Because the answer is no, it's not good. It is not good at all. Because when you look at demographics, the headline figures can often be misleading. And a figure like 70% can cause people to underestimate the gravity of the problem. This is because the average age of an ethnic group and their rate of fertility is just as important or even more important as the group's overall size. When you look at a population pyramid, you can see whether an ethnic group is on average young or older and whether it is breeding at a rate above or below replacement. And this, as you probably have guessed, is where the bad news starts. I mean, it's all been bad news, so this is where the worse news starts. In Britain, the younger the demographic you look at, the closer white Britons are to being a minority. I said earlier, the data from the census, the demographic data we get every 10 years, is notoriously unreliable and gives a much more positive view of the ethnic makeup of Britain. However, much more reliable data is actually available from the government. And that data comes from schools and maternity wards. This data is collected by officials, and everyone in the school system and every birth that takes place in a hospital is accounted for. So it's not down to the public to enter their own data, and that makes the data much more reliable and gives a much more accurate view of the situation. So, in British schools, for the last year we have data for, the ethnic makeup was 61.3% white British. And that accounts for children aged 5 to 16. Now, when you look at primary schools, which is younger children, children aged 5 to 11, things get slightly worse, with primary schools being 60.9% white British. And once you move to maternity wards and look at newborns, the data gets much worse, with just 55.6% of all live births being white British. The most diverse and multicultural demographic in Britain is that of newborns. The demographic which is undeniably the future of the country. But more shockingly, 37.3% of all babies born on British soil are born to couples where one or more parent was born outside of the UK, with newborns being born to mothers who were born outside of the UK, making up 31.8% of all live births. This shocking figure helps to illustrate how the UK immigration system allows migrants to colonise Britain. In short, it works like this. Males come to the UK, most likely to work. Once they arrive, they establish a base and acquire a property. They then send for their wives, or they go home and spend a night with their wife, who then, by total coincidence, visits them in Britain on the week she's going to give birth to their child. And that's how chain migration works. The man is granted the work visa, his wife visits him or comes with him, she gives birth to the child on British soil, giving the child an entitlement to some form of birthright citizenship. And then his parents will never leave or be deported as their child has a British birth certificate. That's how one single work visa can end up bringing an entire family of migrants to Britain and allow them to settle permanently. But what makes it even worse is this often continues for generations, with the child who was born on British soil returning to his ancestral homeland, engaging in some form of arranged marriage, bringing his bride to Britain, and it all starts over and over again. And generations of migrants are brought to Britain and given some kind of citizenship. And all of this sounds pretty grim. But believe it or not, it gets worse. The fertility rate in Britain is 1.4. And you can probably guess what I'm going to say next. That 1.4 is an average. And that average is dragged up dramatically by migrants and those of migrant descent. And if you look at the fertility rate of the indigenous people of white Britons, the best estimate is around 1.1, and that could well be an optimistic guess. So now we've looked at the youngest part of the population pyramid, let's look at the oldest. And that, if you hadn't already guessed, is where white Britons are the greatest majority. Whilst white Britons are close to being a minority in maternity wards, we are massively overrepresented in old people's homes. There are 12.7 million people over the age of 65 in Britain, and the vast majority of those, 93%, are white British. So it's a good time for a quick recap. White Britons are 70% of the overall population, 55.6% in maternity wards, and 93% of those over the age of 65. So it's not just about the headline figure. It's not just about the 70%. It's about the average age and the fertility rate. So let's look at that 12.7 million people in Britain who are over the age of 65. I said earlier, 93% of them are white British, meaning that 11.8 million white Britons are over 65 years of age. And in 25 years' time, between 11.2 million and 11.3 million of those white Britons will be dead. And that's not me being morbid. It's a statistical fact, because only 600,000 people in Britain make it over the age of 90. That means over the next 25 years, 23% of the white British population will be gone. They will be dead. And for every one of those white Britons who die, at least one migrant will settle in Britain to take their place. Because despite white Britons having a fertility rate well below replacement, and despite a huge dying off of elderly white Brits, our population is growing at the fastest rate it has ever grown in recorded history. And everything I've said so far perfectly illustrates the trifecta of white replacement. A perfect storm that will reduce white Britons to minority status. We have record immigration, overwhelmingly from non-white countries. We have a critically low indigenous birth rate. And finally, we have an ageing population which will see a massive dying off over the next quarter of a century. But we don't actually have data for 25 years in the future. We can only produce models that allow us to predict how these trends will play out. So people say, we can't be 100% sure what will happen. But what we can be 100% sure of is what has already happened. So let's look at the data we have, not for the next 25 years, but for the last quarter of a century. Let's see how Britain has changed over the last 25 years. In 1999/2000, white Britons made up approximately 90% of the population. By 2024/2025, where we are now, white Britons are down to approximately 70% of the population, meaning we've been declining at an average rate of 0.8% per year. But that sugarcoats it, because I'm using an average, and the decline has not been uniform, but has been an accelerating process. But even if the decline does remain stable at 0.8% per year, that means in the next 2 decades, white Britons will be reduced to just 54% of the population. And that's if the decline remains stable. If the process continues to accelerate as it has been doing, then by 2050, white Britons will be a minority. And that's 16 years earlier than demographers predicted in 2013. You see, back in 2013, the Conservative press published a story. And that was that leading demographers in 2013 had stated that white Britons could be a minority by 2066 if trends continued. However, the trends that they were reporting on have accelerated so quickly that in the last 12 years, the date of 2066 has been brought forward by more than a decade and a half. So you probably all sat there thinking, this is pretty bad stuff. This is pretty dark. Where's the good news? Because no one comes to a conference like this to simply hear bad news. Everyone wants to hear that something good is on the horizon. Well, the good news is this. As this process, which I have just discussed and described in great detail, has accelerated, and as the demographic shift has become more and more obvious to normal people, a couple of things have happened. The first is that politicians and those in the media have had to admit that the Great Replacement is real and a white minority is inevitable if things do not change. At one point, everything I just laid out for you was branded as a far-right conspiracy theory. But now, our message is accepted as the truth. So much so that our anti-white Labour Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, a man who made his fortune representing failed asylum seekers and fighting against their deportation, has had to admit that not only is everything I've just said real and happening, but that it has not happened by accident, but by the result of government policy. This is no secret anymore. White replacement is real, and it came about by design. But there is more good news, and that is that there has been a mass awakening to this truth amongst the general public. More and more people are aware of the demographic changes taking place, and more people are openly voicing their opposition to the changes I have described. The problem is this, though, and this problem is most likely a problem that exists in every Western European nation and in America, Canada, Australia, and other white nations around the world. People only wake up to the truths that I've just described when the problem is already at an advanced stage. Very few people wake up to the reality of demographic change when they are living in an all-white area. When whites do live in a homogeneous area, most of them can't accept the fact that one day they could be a minority. And that's the problem with the mass awakening to race and demographics. Our people's awakening is linked to the severity, visibility, and immediate nature of the problem, which often means that by the time people do wake up, the area in which they are living has already been colonised or is rapidly approaching the tipping point, which will see it become another area where whites are outnumbered. And this is what could be described as the race of our time, and it will determine a large part of our future. We are undergoing a huge, seismic racial awakening, one which will see not thousands, not tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but millions of white people all over the Western world adopting our talking points and waking up to the reality of race and white genocide. However, at the same time, we are becoming a minority at an ever-accelerating rate. The question is this: which comes first? Do we become a minority, or do we wake up at the 11th hour and win our nations back? And I know what most people here today will want me to say. You all want me to say, of course we will. We're all going to wake up en masse at the last minute and things will be okay. There's going to be a hero. He's going to arrive on a white horse. He'll ride in, he'll rescue us all at the last moment, and he'll kick out all the invaders, all the people who don't belong here, and everything's gonna be good. And I'm not going to say that, because I can't say that will happen. And I'm not going to start giving you answers that are going to make you smile just to please you, because that would be misleading you, and in many ways it would be counterproductive. But I do have another answer to this question of whether we become a minority or not. And some people aren't going to like this, but in many ways this is a much more profound and honest answer to the question. In many ways, does it matter? To me, does it matter if my people become a minority? And that's an answer, but it's also a question. And the answer I've just given you will confuse people. I can see confused faces. It will upset people. And it will enrage people. And it will cause people to say that I have given up. And it'll also be an answer that will be misquoted and taken out of context. But I ask you, please hear me out. Whether we become a minority or whether we remain a majority, our fight does not change. Whatever happens over the next 25 years, whatever those next 25 years have in store for us, our goal will remain the same. And what we do and what we fight for will not change. Whatever happens, we will fight for the future of our race and nation, regardless of the circumstances. Regardless of whether we are outnumbered, regardless of whether we are outgunned, regardless of whether we have our backs to the wall, we will fight and we will never give in. Because the people in this room today, the people watching on stream, we are the few. The people here today, the people watching, we are the brave men and women who carried the message of the importance of race and white replacement and white genocide, the importance of our nation, of blood and soil, when that message was deeply unpopular. We carried that torch of our people's existence when no one else was interested, when people turned their backs, when no one would listen, and when people laughed at us. When people spat at us and called us conspiracy theorists and nutcases, we soldiered on and carried and nurtured that flame. And now the flame that we nurtured and protected in the darkest of times, when it seemed like the light of our people may be extinguished, well, what did we do with that flame? Well, to put it mildly, we helped it spread. We helped it grow. Ladies and gentlemen, we nurtured that flame, the very same flame that has started the raging fire that we see burning today. And I can tell you this, whether we remain a majority or whether we do wither in some nations to a minority, whilst there are still proud white men and women, we will fight. Just like we fought through the dark times when no one would listen to us. You see, this is the really good news. We are white people, and white people are a remarkable, beautiful, inventive, and incredible race. Everything you see around you that defines the modern era is the product of people of European descent. And that's why, minority or not, I will never lose faith in our people. And I know that in my heart of hearts, we will eventually be victorious. And one day we will take back everything. And I mean everything that is ours. And I started today talking about this demographic nightmare. One, which may well reduce white Britons to a minority in 2050. And I gave you lots of statistics to back that up, didn't I? But I'm going to give you a statistic now, which is far more important than any of the statistics I've given you so far today. If we become a minority in 2050, we in Britain would be left with somewhere between 30 and 40 million white Britons. And if I tell you anything today with total certainty, it's this. 30 to 40 million white Britons working together as a proud and racially conscious people is not only enough to take back Britain, it's not only enough to conquer the world. We had the biggest empire the world's ever seen when we had just 30 to 40 million white Britons. 30 to 40 million white Britons is enough to reach up to the stars and conquer everything in this universe. Because we are the sons and daughters of Europe. And in my humble opinion, we are the greatest people to ever walk the earth. And we've overcome incredible odds before. And you know what? We might end up as a minority in some countries. But with the great awakening that is taking place, we can be sure that we will end up with tens of millions of racially conscious European people all over this great continent, elsewhere in the world, who will all want to come together and reclaim what is rightfully theirs. Whether we are a majority or a minority, it does not change what we do. It does not change our goal. And it does not strip us of our birthright. Whatever happens, we do one thing. We fight, and we fight through the good and through the bad. And why do we fight? Well, of course, that hasn't changed. We fight for the same reason we have always fought. To secure an existence for our people and a future for white children. Thank you.